Hi, friends. Hope you're having a great day. I was just thinking about you guys, and I came across a story called Flat Stanley. Never had read that before. I'd always heard about it, but I'd never read it. And so I decided it might be fun to read this with you today, and then I'm going to tell you about a little project we can do all together. Okay, so my story today is called Flat Stanley. It's written by Jeff Brown, and the illustrator is Scott Nash. Flat Stanley. Hey, come look, Arthur Lambchop yelled. He called from his bedroom door he shared with his brother Stanley. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop cared greatly for politeness and correct speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, said Mrs. Lambchop. But look, said Arthur, pointing. So then the parents looked. Across Stanley's bed lay the enormous bulletin board. It had fallen on Stanley during the night. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop hurried to lift it from the bed. But Stanley wasn't hurt. What's going on here? He said cheerfully as he sat up. Heavens, cried Mrs. Lambchop. Gosh, said Arthur, Stanley's flat. As a pancake, said Mr. Lambchop. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Mrs. Lambchop sighed. Let's all have breakfast. Then we'll hear what Dr. Dan has to say. In his office, Dr. Dan examined Stanley. How do you feel? He asked. I felt sort of tickly after I got up, Stanley said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it is with these cases, said Dr. Dan. Then the nurses took Stanley's measurements. And they're just checking to see how big he is. Being flat could be fun. Stanley enjoyed going in and out of rooms by sliding through the crack at the bottom of the door. Arthur tried too, but he just banged his head. Being flat could be exciting during the holidays. Stanley was invited to his friend Thomas's in California. Mr. Lambchop brought home an enormous brown envelope. And then he just said to Stanley, try to see if this one will fit. And the envelope fit Stanley perfectly. And the next morning, his parents slid him into it along with an egg salad sandwich and mailed him from the box on the corner. Stanley had a fine time in California. Look at all the things he was doing. He's flat, but he's laying out at the beach. He's having ice cream. It looks like his friend is maybe riding on him in this picture because Stanley's flat and he's been the surfboard. And it looks like here maybe they went on an adventure. Thomas's family returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. They marked it airmail and wrote valuable, and this ended up on both sides. In the park one Sunday afternoon, Stanley and Arthur watched some boys flying big kites. Someday, Arthur said, I would like to have a big kite. You can fly me, Arthur, Stanley said. Come on. He gave Arthur a spool of string and he attached himself to himself. Then he ran across the grass to catch the wind. Up, up, up went Stanley. Arthur let out all the string and Stanley soared high above the trees. Everyone stood still to watch. Can you imagine flying your brother as a kite? But Arthur got tired of running with an empty spool. Wedging it in the fork of a tree, he went off to have a hot dog. He didn't notice when Stanley became tangled in the branches of the tree. Half an hour passed before Arthur heard Stanley's shouts and climbed up the tree to set him free. Arthur apologized and over again that evening, but still Stanley was cross. See how he's got his arms folded? He's a little bit upset with his brother for forgetting him. The next morning, Mr. Lambchop and Stanley met their neighbor, Mr. O.J. Dart, the director of the famous art museum. Mr. Dart looked worried. Another valuable painting was stolen from the famous museum last night, he told Stanley and his father. The police suspect a gang of sneak thieves. They work at night by sneakery, which makes it very difficult to catch. Stanley had an idea. He explained it to Mr. Dart. Excellent, said Mr. Dart. We'll try out your plan tonight. So what do you think their plan might be, guys? That evening, in the main hall of the museum, Mr. Dart showed Stanley the most expensive painting in the world. It's right here. You see it? Next to it was an empty picture frame. It's over here. And now, Stanley, said Mr. Dart, it's time for your disguise. Stanley showed Mr. Dart the disguise he had brought. He's dressed up as a cowboy, isn't he? This is a really good one. My cowboy hat and red bandana. I'm sorry, Mr. Dart said, but we don't have cowboy pictures. Here, you must wear the disguise I have chosen. Stanley could hardly speak when he saw Mr. Dart's disguise. I'll look like a girl, he protested. But Stanley was a good sport, and he put it on. Look at this outfit they picked out for Stanley. You see it? In the main hall, Stanley climbed into the empty picture frame, and he stood very still. Very nice, said Mr. Dart, and he went off to arrange the rest of their plan. Now Stanley was alone, and the hall was very dark, but enough moonlight came through the windows for him to see the world's most expensive painting. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come, he thought. Then, creak! A glow of yellow light shone suddenly in the center of the hall. A trapdoor had opened in the floor. The sneak thieves, carrying lanterns, came up into the hall. I think I'd be a little scared. The thieves took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. This is it, Max, said the first thief, whose name was Luther. In all this great city, there is no one to suspect us. Then Luther saw Stanley in his frame. I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max, he said. This one looks scared. Stanley managed a tiny smile. She is smiling, sort of, Max said. And what a pretty little thing she is, too. That made Stanley furious. In his loudest voice, he shouted, Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here! Max, Luther whispered, I think I heard the sheep girl yell. Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest, Max whispered back. You'll get a rest, all right, shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with lots of policemen. You'll get arrested, that's what. The sneak thieves were quickly handcuffed and led to jail. The next morning, Stanley Lambchop got a medal from the chief of police. The day after that, his picture was in the newspapers. For a while, Stanley was famous. People would point him out and whisper, Over there, Agnes, Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the museum robbers. and things like that. But then people began to make fun of him. Well, he is super skinny, they would call. That's not so nice, is it? Late one night, Arthur woke to the sound of Stanley crying. "What's wrong?" Stanley sighed. "I want to be a regular shape again, like people. It's not fair." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really, really are." And then Arthur had an idea. He turned on the light and ran to the big toy box in the corner. He tossed aside the toy soldiers, airplanes, and boat models. "Got it," he said, holding up an old bicycle pump. You thinking what I'm thinking, friends? "Okay, Stanley." After a moment, but take it easy, he stood with the end of the hose in his mouth, clamping his lips tightly so no air would escape. Arthur began to pump. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hand," he said, and Stanley's top half began to swell. Stanley got bigger and bigger, and his pajama buttons burst off. Oops, sorry. Soon he was all rounded out except for his right foot. He shook the foot twice, and it swelled to match the other one. There stood Stanley Lambchop, as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." And Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop came in to see what the boys were up to so late at night. "George," said Mrs. Lambchop, "Stanley's round again." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the brothers back into bed and turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. Very soon, all the Lambchops were asleep. The end. So, friends, I thought it was kind of fun as Stanley became flat at first, and he was able to do things that we as people can't do because we are 3D and rounded. So I was thinking maybe it would be a good idea and fun if we did a little adventure. In the mail, I have sent you a flat Miss Bradley. Now, don't do anything too mean to me or call me any names like they did in that book. But I would like to go on an adventure or two with you. So if you will take me someplace at your house, maybe while you're fixing breakfast one morning or while you're playing with your toys, and then you could have your family or your mom or your dad or brother or sister take a quick picture, and then if you'll send it to me at my email, then I will post it. And we can kind of see what all of our classmates are doing. I thought it might be a good way for us to keep in touch since we can't see each other each day. And we know we all miss each other. And I thought it could be a little bit fun. I hope that sounds fun to you. And I'll look forward to seeing your snapshots of you with Mrs. Bradley, the flat Mrs. Bradley. Take care. Love you guys. And I sure do miss you. Bye-bye.